My mom left home when I was 8. She didn't feel like being a mom anymore, but I didn't know that at the time. I just thought my dad took us. He moved us back to the homestead. I was raised on a ranch in Alaska. My dad became abusive. He was raised in an abusive household, and I moved out at 15, and I knew statistically girls like me end up repeating the pattern. And so you either end up in an abusive relationship or you end up in drugs or on the pole in a matter of years. And I wanted to see if I could avoid being a statistic. And I looked at nature versus nurture. And I thought if I didn't like my nurture, could I re-nurture myself? And so that's what I set out to do when I was 15. And it led me on a very crazy, long, winding road.
Today, Reshaping Culture features singer-songwriter Jewel for the extraordinary way in which she reshaped her thinking and emotional life. If she can do it, then you can too. Enjoy.
You know, it's interesting. When I was homeless, I realized I was very lonely. And I realized one of the reasons I was lonely is because I didn't tell the truth, except for in a notebook that nobody ever read. And I deserved to be lonely because nobody ever got the opportunity to know me, because I learned that being alone made me feel safe. When I was a young girl growing up in Alaska, I didn't have access to much television, but I had access to books. But I realized when I was homeless that it actually disconnected me, and it separated me and isolated me to the point where I couldn't feel human connection or joy of connection. And I wanted to change that. And so I very purposefully switched my safety strategy from armor to vulnerability. And I started writing very honest songs, very revealing songs. I wanted to document an honest life. And I really appreciated the writers that were honest, that didn't use art as propaganda to make themselves seem more perfect than they were. Right. And so I was drawn to artists like Bukowski and Anais Nin, not because I wanted to be them or live their lifestyles, but because I really appreciated the courage that it took to say their flaws along with their talents. And that made me feel more hopeful as a young child that maybe there wasn't something wrong with me. Because when you look through those magazines and you see pretty perfect people, you just feel alienated. And so I made a promise when I was quite young to write honestly and to never use my art as propaganda. And I try to stay true to that my whole career. In the beginning, it was really just how lonely and afraid I was. Talking about panic attacks that I was stealing, things that felt very shameful to me at the time. Now those don't really carry any shame for me, but at the time they were big confessions. I was agoraphobic, and that's what my songs were about. And when I got signed, I decided to keep doing that. Because I did notice that in fame, people tend to get put on a pedestal. And a lot of celebrities promote this image of perfection, of perfect beauty, of perfect happiness. And it isolates the artist, and it's not honest, because none of us are always happy or perfect. And then it also distances you from the viewer. They feel like you're this perfect piece of royalty, and they can never be like you, and it creates this gap. And I didn't want that. I didn't want a gap between me and my audience, because I was one of them. And so I tried to constantly take myself off of a pedestal and lead with the truth and lead with my flaws. And I did that my whole career, and it ended up saving me. The vulnerability really isn't. That's where safety is to be vulnerable. I didn't start writing songs till I was 16, really just so I could street sing and earn a living on spring breaks. And then my mom came back into my life when I was 18, when I got discovered while I was homeless. And it was a really difficult relationship. My big break was at the end of being homeless. It was about a year of being homeless. I was singing in a coffee shop every Thursday night, just trying to save enough money for a deposit on an apartment, and I got discovered accidentally. A radio DJ had heard about this girl that had a following. Started with 2 people, and then by the end of the year, I had a decent following, and he put a bootleg on the radio, and I ended up in the top 10 countdown of a very big station called 91X in San Diego. And labels heard about that, and they started coming down, and limousines started showing up, and they had no idea I was homeless, and they'd be like, you know, they'd take me to these dinners that cost more than I made in my entire life. And I had a bidding war. Every label tried to sign me. It was very, very surreal. I had no idea something like that could happen for me. And I was offered $1 million signing bonus as a homeless kid. But I had read a book about how the business works, and that's a loan, and you owe the loan back. And I had realized that my happiness was in my authenticity and in my honesty, and that I probably wouldn't make records that would end up on the radio. I was a folk singer at the height of grunge. And so I turned down $1 million signing bonus, and I took a big back end so that if I ever sold a record, I would then earn money. And it saved me, because my record didn't sell for 2 years, and I would have been dropped for sure if I hadn't turned down that signing bonus. In my book, I talk about cycles of abuse. and how we have these emotional inheritances that get passed on generationally. And until we learn a new emotional language, we will speak the language we were raised with. And my dad very courageously allowed me to talk about some pretty hard stuff in my book, not only about the abuse he was raised in, but how he then became an abusive father, much to his horror. But he didn't get to learn a new emotional language. And he had a lot of PTSD, and he turned to alcohol when my mom left to try and calm his anxiety, and then he started repeating the pattern he was raised with. And then the shame cycle kicks in for him, and that's why I moved out when I was so young. My dad amazingly changed in his 50s and taught himself a new emotional language. It's heroic. I think that's one of the most heroic things a person can do, is to change, to be willing to take the work and rewire their brain. It's what I wanted to do, and I did that in my early 20s and continue to do it. But to see my dad do it in his 50s and 60s was very touching. My mom left when I was 8. My dad also became abusive and began drinking at that age, and I moved out at 15. I knew statistically kids like me should end up repeating the cycle. So I knew statistically kids like me should end up in a ditch or on drugs or in an abusive relationship, and I was determined not to be a statistic. And I paid rent and I worked hard, and I studied people, and I learned to find new mentors, to learn new emotional languages. And then fast forward 3 years, I wouldn't sleep with a boss. He fired me, wouldn't give me my paycheck. I ended up living in my car. My car got stolen. I became homeless. I started shoplifting. Originally, I was helping take care of my mom in San Diego. I'd moved there after I graduated high school. She had a heart condition, so I was helping take care of her. And I had a job working at a computer warehouse, and my boss took me aside to have a talk with me one day, and I realized he was propositioning me. And I joked it off. I didn't think a lot about it. I just turned him down, and it wasn't like a big blow up, but I went in for my paycheck the next day because my rent was due, and he ignored me. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't give me my paycheck. And so we got kicked out of where I was living. My mom went back to Alaska. I was living in my car, and then my car got stolen, and we ended up homeless for about a year. I tried to get other jobs, but I was having panic attacks. I was becoming agoraphobic. My life was really grinding to a halt. And I looked in the mirror one day while I was stealing something, and I went, I am a statistic. I didn't beat the odds, and I had to do something about it. And that was really a very pivotal time in my life, and when I really started to turn my life around. And my desire to connect became stronger than my desire to be safe. And I decided to do something that was very radical for me, which was to say the truth out loud, expose myself to people.
This is Jewel.
Hi.
This is a place called The Interchange. This is what you started off, what, about a year and a half ago?
Oh, yeah.
I found a coffee shop that was going out of business. I asked them if they could stay open for 1 more month, and she agreed. Her name was Nancy. And I said, can I keep the door money if I bring people in, and you keep the food and coffee? We agreed to that. But my very first show, 2 surfers showed up, and I sang these poor surfers for 5 hours. I sang to them about the most honest, gut-wrenching, vulnerable truths about myself. I read poems, the whole 9 yards. And these 2 surfers cried the whole time, and I cried on stage. And we hugged afterwards because it was such an honest, real, authentic experience we just had all had together. And for me, that was when that really became a powerful thing. I knew that would be a life path for me. I remembered this quote by Buddha that said, happiness does not depend on who you are or what you have, it depends on what you think. And I had the strange privilege of being stripped of everything but what I thought. But I was so anxious, and anybody that's ever suffered from tremendous anxiety knows that you actually can't track your thoughts in real time. They scatter. And so to try and remedy that, I started to invent exercises for myself, one of which was watching my hands. And I would just watch my hands because they're the servants of your thoughts. So if you want to know what you're thinking, watch what your hands are doing, because it's your thought cooled down into action. And so I started taking notes. How many times did I steal? How many times did I shake hands? How many times did I open doors? How many times would I not shake hands? I deduced that I quit believing in myself. I quit thinking I could earn $40. I quit thinking that I could hold a job down. So that was important to see, but there was a tremendous side effect that when I journaled in real time and witnessed myself in real time, my anxiety calmed down. And then I learned so much about fear that year, that fear is this thief, and it takes the past and it projects it into the future, and it robs you of the only moment you have to create change, which is right now. And so then my life's work became, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And if I could rephrase that just a tiny bit, ever so humbly, I would say I perceive what I think, therefore I am. And so I learned that if I could perceive I was sad, I was something other than sad. I was the observer of sad. When you're the observer of your brain, that suddenly puts you in the driver's seat of a very cool machine. So it makes your brain more like a steering wheel, not a driver. And a lot of us confuse those two. We think our brain is the driver, when actually we're the observer of that brain. And our brains are these amazing tools, but they're these binary computers that have neurological wiring and patterning, and they get trained, and you can retrain them. And so a lot of my life's work was about how do I retrain specific patterns I was taught. And so when I got discovered, my life's goal wasn't to be famous or rich, it was to be a happy person. And then my second job was to try and figure out how to be a musician. And I tried to stay true to that my whole career. I have learned with time that the truth always wins. The uncomfortable parts of my personality, the uncomfortable parts of life are true, whether we live in denial of them or not. And I've spent plenty of time in my life denying the truth, wishing it wasn't so, trying to pretend it wasn't so. And all it cost me was years. And then I still had to deal with the truth. And I actually paid a much bigger price. When I was about 29, I realized my mother wasn't who I thought she was. She was my manager. I had such a strong need for my mother's love that I was willing to ignore what other people would have perceived as red flags. I wanted her love much more than I wanted the truth. And that cost me. It cost me a lot of money. It cost me a lot of years. It cost me a lot of heartbreak. And so when I notice I'm agitated, when I'm noticing I'm getting triggered, I just soften. I breathe. My posture's changing, my blood pressure's changing, different biochemicals being released, my vascular system dilates, blood pressure comes down. And then I just need to listen with no agenda. And so that really helps me. It helps me when I'm feeling shame to stop and go, okay, this is a feeling in my body. How do I want to redirect this? And so I turn it into a river in my mind. Where do I want this energy and this water to go? That gets me back into behavior and gets me into, okay, now what am I going to do about it? And then I can start to move on.